Eleanor blinked awake, the first light painting muted stripes across her faded floral curtains. But before her eyes could fully adjust, the familiar ache in her lower back announced its presence. A dull throb, her uninvited morning companion. It wasn't a sharp, stabbing pain, but a deep, pervasive stiffness, as if her very bones had forgotten flexibility overnight. She pushed herself up, a slow, deliberate motion, each joint protesting with a soft, audible groan. "Just getting old, my dear," she'd often murmur to the empty room, a mantra of quiet resignation. Her shoulders felt like rigid planks, her hips reluctant hinges, refusing to swing with the ease they once had. The vibrant Eleanor of 30 years ago, who could spend hours weeding her prize-winning roses, felt like a distant, almost mythical figure. This constant tightness, she reasoned, was simply the toll of 70 years lived. Now, the thought of kneeling in her beloved rose garden brought a deep sigh. Even reaching for the teacup on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet was an exercise in careful calculation, a stretch that promised a sharp twinge if executed carelessly. She'd given up trying to prune the higher branches, leaving them tangled. Each small movement was a conscious effort, a negotiation with her recalcitrant body. It wasn't pain, not precisely, but a pervasive discomfort, a constant reminder of time's relentless march. She missed the simple liberty of movement, the unthinking grace she'd once possessed. A deep, quiet ache settled in her chest, a longing not for lost youth, but for the effortless comfort of her physical self, a body that felt like home. Later, as she carefully lowered herself onto the wrought iron bench outside, her neighbour, Mrs. Henderson, bustled past with her terrier. "Morning, Eleanor. Bit stiff today, are we?" "Don't worry, it happens to us all at our age." Eleanor managed a tight smile, the words a well-meaning dismissal that only solidified her internal narrative. This was simply the weight of years, an inevitable, unchangeable truth. Eleanor retreated indoors, the weight of Mrs. Henderson's words settling heavily upon her, a familiar ache in her knees echoing the sentiment. She clicked on the old television, more out of habit than interest, letting the local community channel drone on in the background. A segment on gardening gave way to an announcement about the upcoming bake sale, and then, surprisingly, a woman with kind, intelligent eyes appeared on screen. The woman, a physical therapist, began to speak about muscle tightness in older adults. "We often hear, 'Oh, it's just age,' don't we?" she said, her voice gentle yet firm. Eleanor, halfway to the kitchen for her afternoon tea, paused. Just age, she thought, a familiar bitterness rising. "But what if I told you," the therapist continued, "that much of that stiffness isn't an inevitable consequence of getting older, but a build-up from years of low movement, poor circulation, and chronic tension?" Eleanor slowly lowered herself into her armchair, her skepticism a heavy cloak. Impossible, she wanted to scoff. Yet, the therapist's words began to chip away at her ingrained belief. "Think about how many hours we spend sitting," the woman urged, illustrating with simple hand gestures. "Or the way stress can knot our shoulders. Or how a lack of gentle, consistent movement starves our tissues of vital blood flow." Eleanor found herself subtly rotating her own stiff neck, then wiggled her toes, suddenly aware of the dull ache in her lower back. It wasn't just age that made her shoulders feel like concrete. She did sit for hours, often hunched over her knitting. And the constant worry about her pension, that certainly kept her tense. A flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, hope, ignited within her. The therapist smiled warmly. These aren't irreversible conditions. With a few simple, consistent practices, many people find significant relief, rediscovering a comfort they thought was long gone. She held up a small booklet, a community program flyer. It's about unwinding those pathways, gently coaxing your body back to ease. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen, her initial dismissal dissolving into genuine, almost desperate curiosity. A simple fix? Could it truly be that straightforward? The idea felt revolutionary, a whispered challenge to the unyielding narrative she had carried for so long. The community program flyer became Eleanor's unlikely beacon. With a hesitant click, she enrolled in the online introductory session. A small part of her still braced for disappointment. But the instructor's calm voice, echoing the therapist's earlier words, instilled a fragile hope. Eleanor started small, just as suggested. Every morning, before the kettle whistled, she'd sit on the edge of her bed, practicing the prescribed mindful breathing. Deep, deliberate inhales and slow, gentle exhales that felt foreign yet strangely soothing. Throughout the day, she'd catch herself hunched over her laptop, then consciously reset her posture, imagining a string pulling her spine upwards, her shoulders relaxing. Initially, it felt clumsy, a performance for an unseen audience. But as days bled into weeks, these gentle movements and conscious resets began to weave themselves into the fabric of her routine. A quiet stretch before reaching for the top shelf. A few deliberate ankle rotations while waiting for the microwave. A moment of stillness and breath before tackling a new task. She wasn't pushing, merely listening, gently coaxing her body rather than demanding from it. She kept a small journal, noting her efforts, and to her astonishment, began to record subtle victories. The morning stiffness, once a rigid prison, softened to a dull ache that faded quicker. Her hands, once reluctant, moved with more fluidity as she kneaded dough for bread. The most profound change bloomed in her garden. Where once stooping had been an act of painful defiance, she now found herself kneeling with relative ease, her fingers reconnecting with the cool earth, planting new seeds, pruning overgrown roses. The joy of nurturing life, once overshadowed by physical discomfort, returned with a vibrant intensity. The heavy cloak of resignation she had worn for years began to unravel, replaced by a lightness she hadn't realized she'd missed. "I can feel looser and more comfortable with small daily habits," she whispered one evening, tracing the lines on her palm. It wasn't a dramatic cure, but a gentle, persistent unwinding, a path paved not with grand gestures, but with consistent, mindful steps. Eleanor realized the profound power of these tiny acts of self-care, rediscovering not just comfort, but a resilient, hopeful version of herself she thought was lost forever. The path ahead was still long, but she now walked it with purpose, her own gentle unwinding.